All the staff avoided the billionaire who controlled everything, until a child dared to tell him the truth. He was the shadow every maid prayed they'd never meet. Harrison Rothwell, a billionaire whose cruelty was whispered about like a curse. Staff vanished after a single mistake, leaving behind only warnings. Never be seen, never be heard, and above all, never, ever defy him. For years, silence ruled his glass palace in the clouds. Until one afternoon, when an 11-year-old girl stepped out of hiding and told the monster the one thing no one else dared. "You should apologize." 11-year-old Clara believed monsters only lived under beds, not in penthouses. But Mr. Rothwell, the man whose floors her mother polished, was a different kind of creature, and he was about to show his teeth. The Rothwell penthouse was less a home and more a museum of silence. It occupied the entire top floor of the tallest building in the city, a glass palace suspended in the clouds. Sunlight poured through windows as tall as oak trees, but it never seemed to warm the place. It only highlighted the absence of life, gleaming off polished marble floors and chrome surfaces that rejected fingerprints. There were no photographs on the gleaming tables, no crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator, no comfortable clutter of a life well lived. There was only space, cold and vast and intimidating. Clara Mayhew sat on a small stool tucked away in a utility closet that smelled of lavender-scented cleaner and starch. The door was propped open just enough for a sliver of the grand living room to be visible. Her small hands rested on a thick history book opened in her lap, but her eyes were not on the page. They were fixed on her mother, Helen. Helen Mayhew moved through the enormous space with a quiet, practiced grace. She was a ghost in a simple blue uniform, her movements efficient and silent. She cleaned with a deep, focused respect for the objects around her, wiping down a glass table with a soft cloth as if she were tending to a priceless artifact. To Clara, her mother was the most graceful person in the world. She could erase a smudge without a sound and leave behind nothing but a perfect, invisible shine. She had taught Clara that their job was to be unseen and unheard, to be the quiet magic that made a place perfect without leaving a trace of themselves behind. Clara was only here because it was a school holiday, and the woman who usually watched her was sick. Helen had brought her to work with a long list of instructions, the most important being, "You stay in this closet, you read your book, and you do not make a sound. We are lucky Mrs. Gable allows this. Do you understand, sweet pea?" Clara had nodded solemnly. She understood. She understood the hushed tones her mother used when talking about this job. She understood the tired lines that framed her mother's eyes when she came home each evening. This job paid for their small apartment, for their groceries, for the new pair of shoes Clara needed for school. This job was important, and Mr. Harrison Rothwell, the owner of all this cold silence, was a man to be feared. Clara had never seen him. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, spoke of him in the same way the people in her history book spoke of unpredictable kings. Mrs. Gable was a tall, severe woman with her gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull her face taut. She had greeted them at the private elevator that morning, her eyes scanning Clara as if looking for dirt. "He is not expected today," she had said to Helen, her voice a low hum of authority. "But one can never be certain. You know the rules. No mistakes, no disturbances. He values his quiet." She had then looked down at Clara. "And she is to remain completely out of sight. If he were to find a child here." Mrs. Gable didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and cold. Clara returned her attention to the living room. Her mother was just finishing the final inspection of the main area, her reflection sliding across the polished floor. A faint smile touched Helen's lips. It was the quiet smile of a job well done. She turned to gather her cleaning caddy, and in that moment, the sound that all staff dreaded echoed through the penthouse. It was the soft, electronic chime of the private elevator, announcing an arrival. Helen froze. Her body went rigid, and the small smile vanished from her face. Clara saw her mother's hands clench at her sides. From her hiding spot, Clara's own heart began to beat a little faster. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid open with a whisper. A man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit that probably cost more than their car. His hair was the color of salt and pepper, cut short and neat. His face was a mask of stern lines and sharp angles. and his eyes, even from across the room, looked like chips of ice. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. This had to be him. Mr. Harrison Rothwell. He didn't seem to notice Helen, who stood perfectly still, trying to melt into the pale gray walls. He walked across the room, his expensive leather shoes making sharp, unforgiving clicks on the marble. Each click sounded like a hammer blow in the silent room. He stopped in front of the massive window that overlooked the city, a tiny king surveying his kingdom. Helen, seeing her chance, began to move, trying to slip away toward the service hallway. She moved slowly, a step at a time, her body held tight with tension. She was almost at the edge of the grand Persian rug when his voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. You. Helen stopped instantly, her back to him. She turned around slowly. Yes, Mr. Rothwell. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the city below. I was not aware you were scheduled for a deep clean today. No, sir. Just the usual maintenance, Helen said, her voice barely a whisper. I was just finishing up. He finally turned his head, and his icy gaze fell upon her. He looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive appraisal that made Clara's stomach clench. It was as if he were inspecting a piece of furniture he was considering throwing away. Finishing up, he repeated, his tone flat. He took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an imperfection. His gaze landed on the glass coffee table, the one Helen had just polished to a flawless sheen. He walked over to it, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. He looked down at the gleaming surface, then back at Helen. This table, he said. Did you clean it? Yes, sir. Just now. He nodded slowly. A strange, unpleasant smile touched the corner of his mouth. I see. Then, he did something that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He tilted his hand. The white ceramic cup of coffee tipped over, and a river of dark brown liquid cascaded onto the perfect, gleaming glass. It dripped over the edge, splattering onto the pristine white rug below. The dark stain spread like a wound. Helen let out a tiny, involuntary gasp. Mr. Rothwell set the now empty cup down on the table with a soft clink. He looked at the mess he had made, and then he looked at Helen. The cruel smile was still on his face. It seems you missed a spot, he said, his voice laced with a mocking tone. You spilled. How clumsy of you. Helen stared at him, her face pale with shock and confusion. Mr. Rothwell, Are you contradicting me? He cut in, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. No, sir, Helen whispered, her eyes dropping to the floor. The fight went out of her, replaced by a deep, weary resignation. She knew the rules of this game. The man with all the money was always right. I'm sorry, sir. I'll clean it up immediately. See that you do, he said, his voice returning to its dismissive chill. Properly this time. He turned his back on her and walked toward his office, leaving Helen standing there, staring at the stain. Clara watched as her mother's shoulders slumped. She saw her mother's hands tremble as she walked to her cleaning caddy to get the special sprays and cloths for the rug. Humiliation radiated from her in waves. She was being treated like she was nothing, a toy for a rich man's cruel game. Something inside Clara snapped. It was a feeling she'd only had a few times in her life. It was the same feeling she got when a bully at school tried to take her friend's lunch money. Her grandfather, Walter Mayhew, had been a soldier, a decorated hero from a war fought long before she was born. He had taught her many things before he passed away, but the most important lesson was a simple one. There are times to be quiet, Clarabelle, he would say, his voice a warm rumble. And there are times to stand your ground. A good person knows the difference. Watching her mother kneel on the floor, her face a mask of shame as she began to blot the coffee stain, Clara knew which time this was. The fear that had kept her glued to the stool evaporated, replaced by a hot, fierce fire. She pushed open the closet door and walked out into the vast, silent room. Her small sneakers made no sound on the thick rug. She walked right up to the edge of the stain, her small fists clenched at her sides. Helen looked up, her eyes wide with panic when she saw her daughter. Clara, go back, she hissed, her voice trembling. But Clara didn't look at her mother. She looked toward the office where Mr. Rothwell had disappeared. She took a deep breath, and her voice, though small, rang out clear and steady in the silent penthouse. You should apologize. The sound of her own voice surprised her, but she didn't let it show. She stood her ground, her chin held high. From the office, The sound of rustling papers stopped. A moment later, Mr. Rothwell appeared in the doorway. He looked at Clara, a tiny, blonde-haired girl in jeans and a bright yellow sweater, standing defiantly in his million-dollar living room. A look of genuine surprise crossed his features, quickly replaced by cold annoyance. "What is this?" he demanded, his eyes flicking to Helen. "What is a child doing here?" Helen scrambled to her feet. "I'm so sorry, sir. She was meant to stay hidden. It won't happen again." "Clara, apologize to Mr. Rothwell and go back to the closet right now." But Clara did not move. She met the billionaire's icy stare with her own unwavering gaze. "He should apologize to you, Mom," she said firmly. "He's the one who made the mess. And he lied about it. He said you did it." A thick, dangerous silence fell over the room. Helen looked like she was about to faint. She grabbed Clara's arm, her grip tight. "Clara, please." Mr. Rothwell took a slow step forward, a dark shadow looming over them. He looked down at Clara, and for the first time, he seemed to actually see her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Then, he did something Clara didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the cold, empty space. It was the sound of a man who found the world, and everyone in it, to be a bitter joke. Well, he said, the laugh dying as quickly as it had come. "The mouse has a cub, and she has teeth." He crouched down slowly, bringing himself closer to Clara's level. His eyes were like chips of blue ice. "You think you're brave, little girl?" "My grandpa was brave," Clara said, her voice not wavering. "He said you don't let bullies win, even if they're bigger than you." The amusement vanished from Mr. Rothwell's face. His expression hardened into something cold and sharp. He looked from Clara's defiant face to Helen's terrified one. He stood up, towering over them once more. He looked at Helen. "You're fired." The words hit Helen like a physical blow. The color drained from her face. "Mr. Rothwell, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "She's just a child. She doesn't understand. I need this job, and I need staff who can follow simple instructions," he retorted coldly. "The first of which is not to bring their loud, opinionated offspring to my home." "I'm not loud," Clara said, unable to stop herself. "And I'm not opinionated. I'm just telling the truth. You were mean to my mom." Mr. Rothwell ignored her. He looked back at Helen, a strange, calculating glint in his eye. He seemed to be thinking, his mind working behind the cold mask. The silence stretched on, thick with Helen's despair and Clara's defiance. Then, he spoke again, his voice dangerously soft. "No, on second thought, you're not fired." Helen looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Not yet," he continued. He looked down at Clara, his lips twisting into that same cruel smile. "You've presented me with a curiosity, an experiment." He turned his attention back to Helen. "You will continue your duties. But from now on, the girl comes with you. Every day after school." Helen was stunned. "Sir, you heard me," he said. "I want to see her. I want to see this bravery. Let's see how long it lasts when it's your mother's job on the line every single day." He looked directly at Clara, his eyes boring into hers. "Welcome to the penthouse, little girl. The games are about to begin." He turned without another word and walked back into his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving Clara and her mother standing in the chilling silence. The dark stain on the rug a stark reminder of the battle that had just been declared. Helen pulled Clara into a tight, trembling hug, her relief warring with a new and terrible fear. Clara had stood her ground, just like her grandpa taught her. But in doing so, she hadn't won a victory. She had just volunteered them both for a longer, crueler war. The days that followed were a masterclass in quiet cruelty. Mr. Rothwell's games were not loud or obvious. They were a series of small, calculated tests designed to fray Helen's nerves and chip away at Clara's resolve. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in creating situations that were impossible to navigate without fault. He was a spider, and they were two flies caught in his meticulously designed web. The new routine was torturous for Helen. Each day after school, she would meet Clara at the bus stop, her face etched with a tension that never seemed to leave. They would ride the city bus to the gleaming tower, ascend in the silent, mirrored elevator, and step into the cold expanse of the penthouse. Helen would set about her duties with a frantic, nervous energy, while Clara was instructed to sit on a hard, modern chair in the corner of the living room, in full view of Mr. Rothwell's office. He insisted she be visible at all times. "I want to observe our little soldier," he had declared on the first day of their new arrangement, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Clara would sit with her schoolbooks in her lap, trying to focus on her homework, but the weight of his unseen gaze was a constant pressure. Sometimes, the door to his office would be open a crack, and she could feel him watching her. Other times, it would be closed, but the silence that emanated from it was just as unnerving. The test began simply. He would leave a single, almost invisible smudge on a freshly cleaned window, and then summon Helen, his voice booming through the intercom. "Helen, my office." Now, she would rush in, her hands twisting the fabric of her uniform. Clara would watch, her heart in her throat, as he would point to the infinitesimal flaw. "I pay for perfection," he would say, his voice low and menacing. "This is not perfection. Do it again." And Helen, her face pale, would nod and fetch her cleaning supplies, her hands trembling as she polished the same pane of glass for the 10th time. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His disappointment was a weapon, and he wielded it with surgical precision. Another day, he placed a priceless, delicate crystal vase precariously on the edge of a table, right in the path of her vacuum cleaner. Helen had to navigate around it with the slow, deliberate care of a bomb disposal expert. Clara watched, holding her breath, as her mother worked, sweat beading on her forehead. Mr. Rothwell stood in his office doorway, watching the entire performance with a cold, unblinking stare. The moment Helen was finished, he walked over, picked up the vase, and moved it back to its original, safe position on the mantelpiece without a word. The message was clear: "I am in control. I can break you whenever I choose." The psychological toll on Helen was immense. She grew thinner, the shadows under her eyes deepening. She jumped at every sound and began apologizing for things that weren't her fault. The quiet, graceful confidence Clara had always admired in her mother was being eroded, replaced by a raw, exposed fear. "Why are you doing this, sweet pea?" she would whisper to Clara in the evenings, her voice ragged with exhaustion as she tucked her into bed. "Just stay quiet. Don't look at him. Please. Just let him forget you're there." "He's a bully, Mom," Clara would say, her own small heart aching for her mother's pain. "Grandpa said you can't let bullies win. It just makes them meaner." "Your grandfather never had to pay rent, Clara," Helen would sigh, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "He never had to choose between his pride and keeping a roof over his daughter's head." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She saw the impossible position she had put her mother in. A part of her, the part that loved her mother more than anything in the world, wanted to do as she asked, to become small and invisible, to apologize and appease. But another part, the part that was Walter Mayhew's granddaughter, refused to bend. She could feel her grandfather's voice in her ear, a steadying presence in the overwhelming fear. "Stand your ground, Clarabelle. A good person knows the difference." So Clara endured. She sat on her hard chair day after day, a silent, watchful observer. She did not speak unless spoken to. She met Mr. Rothwell's occasional icy glances with a steady, neutral expression. She refused to show fear. She knew, with the simple, unwavering certainty of a child, that showing him her fear was exactly what he wanted. It was the one thing she would not give him. One rainy Thursday afternoon, the tension in the penthouse reached a new height. Mrs. Gable, the severe head housekeeper, was there for her weekly inspection. She moved through the rooms like a storm cloud, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She and Mr. Rothwell were a perfect pair, two connoisseurs of misery. Clara was trying to read a chapter about the Revolutionary War, but the oppressive atmosphere made it impossible to concentrate. Mr. Rothwell and Mrs. Gable were speaking in low tones in the hallway just outside the living room. Their voices were soft, but their words were sharp enough to cut through the walls. "The agency sent 3 replacements for the kitchen position," Mrs. Gable was saying. "All of them quit within a week. No one wants to work for him." "Then the agency is incompetent," Mr. Rothwell's voice replied, cold as steel. "Find one that isn't. I will not tolerate this level of staff turnover." "It's not the agency, Harrison," Mrs. Gable said, and it was the first time Clara had ever heard anyone use his first name. Her tone was still respectful, but there was an edge to it, a hint of long-suffering familiarity. "It's you. You are impossible to please." You drive them away. I expect excellence. Is that so difficult to comprehend? You expect miracles, Mrs. Gable corrected. And you offer nothing but scorn in return. People will not be treated like dirt, not even for the wages you pay. There was a pause. Clara imagined Mr. Rothwell's face hardening, his eyes turning to ice. Are you offering your resignation, Martha? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. Don't be ridiculous, she snapped back. I'm the only one you haven't managed to scare away. I'm simply stating a fact. You are a difficult man, and you are reaping what you sow. The conversation ended, and a moment later, Mrs. Gable swept into the living room, her face set in a grim mask. She ran a white-gloved finger along a bookshelf that Helen had dusted not an hour before. She inspected the glove, found it spotless, and made a small, dissatisfied sound in the back of her throat. Her gaze then fell upon Clara. Still here, I see, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. Clara just looked at her, saying nothing. Mrs. Gable's eyes narrowed. She seemed to take Clara's quiet defiance as a personal affront. She walked over to the grand piano that sat in the corner of the room, a magnificent instrument of polished black wood that was never played. She lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. Did your mother clean this? She asked, her sharp eyes scanning the pristine ivory and ebony. Yes, ma'am, Helen answered, stepping into the room with her cleaning caddy. I dusted it myself. Mrs. Gable ran her gloved finger along a single white key. Then, as if an idea had just occurred to her, a cruel glint appeared in her eyes. She looked at Clara. Do you play, child? She asked. No, ma'am, Clara said quietly. A pity, Mrs. Gable said. She looked at Helen. Mr. Rothwell has a new policy. He feels the staff is not engaged enough with the environment. He wants everything to be functional, not just decorative. She was lying. Clara knew it instantly. It was a lie spun from pure spite. He has instructed that the piano keys be polished. Not just dusted. Polished. Each one. Individually. Front, top, and sides. Helen stared at her, her expression a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. But that will take hours. I have the entire West Wing to finish. Then you had best get started, Mrs. Gable said with a thin, triumphant smile. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor, leaving the impossible order hanging in the air. Helen looked at the piano, then back at her list of duties, and her shoulders sagged with the weight of it all. A wave of despair washed over her face. She was being asked to do the impossible, and she knew it was a punishment directed at her through the veil of household chores. It was a message, a warning. Clara watched her mother's hands tremble as she set down her caddy and retrieved a special polishing cloth. She saw the unshed tears glistening in her mother's eyes, and the fire that had ignited in her a week ago roared back to life. She slid off her chair. She walked over to her mother, who was now staring at the 88 keys as if they were an army she had to defeat single-handedly. I'll help, Clara said, her voice a small but steady anchor in the sea of her mother's distress. No, Clara, Helen whispered, shaking her head. You'll get in trouble. I'll get in trouble. Just go back to your chair. She said they needed to be polished, Clara insisted. She didn't say who had to do it. If we both do it, it will go faster. Before Helen could protest further, Clara took a clean, dry cloth from the caddy. She sat down on the edge of the piano bench. She looked at the long row of keys. It did look like a big army. She took a deep breath. She remembered a picture in her history book of George Washington's soldiers, tired and cold, but refusing to give up. She reached out and carefully, gently, began to polish the first white key. Helen watched her for a moment, her heart torn. Every instinct screamed at her to pull Clara away, to hide her, to protect her from the wrath of this house. But seeing her daughter's small, determined hands moving with such focused care, seeing the quiet strength in her profile, Helen felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days, pride. She took a deep breath, her own resolve hardening. She sat down on the bench next to her daughter. She picked up her own cloth. Together, in the vast, silent penthouse, under the unseen, watchful eye of the monster in the office, mother and daughter began to polish the piano keys, one by one. They worked in silence, a small, defiant team of two against the world. It was a small rebellion, a quiet refusal to be broken. And with every key that shone a little brighter, Clara felt a little stronger. She didn't know it yet, but the war was about to escalate. And the next battle would be fought over something far more personal than a smudge on a window or dust on a piano. They didn't finish the piano. They couldn't have, even if they had worked all night. After 2 hours of meticulous, back-aching work, a new sound echoed through the penthouse. It was the sharp, commanding buzz of the intercom. "Helen, my office. Both of you." Helen's hand froze mid-polish. She and Clara exchanged a look, a silent communication of shared dread. The summons felt like a precursor to an execution. Slowly, they stood up from the piano bench, their legs stiff. Helen wiped her trembling hands on her apron and took Clara's hand. Her palm was cold and damp. Mr. Rothwell's office was as cold and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, but it was dominated by a single, massive desk of dark, polished mahogany. It sat before a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's-eye view of the city below. Mr. Rothwell was not sitting at the desk. He stood by the window, his back to them, a dark silhouette against the glittering cityscape. "You wish to see us, Mr. Rothwell?" Helen asked, her voice a reedy whisper. He turned around slowly. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm, calculated power. His eyes, however, seemed to burn with a cold fire. He didn't look at Helen. His gaze was fixed entirely on Clara. "It has come to my attention," he began, his voice smooth and low, "that our little soldier has a history project due." Clara's blood ran cold. How could he possibly know that? She clutched her mother's hand tighter. She did have a project due. A big one. It was a presentation on a personal hero, and she had chosen her grandfather, Walter Mayhew. She had her notes and some old photographs in her school backpack, which was tucked away in the utility closet. Mr. Rothwell gestured toward his large, gleaming desk. Lying in the center of the otherwise empty surface was a small, framed photograph. It was a black-and-white picture of a young man in a crisp army uniform, a proud, confident smile on his face. It was Clara's grandfather. It was the photo she kept in the front pocket of her backpack. "I took the liberty of looking through your things," Mr. Rothwell said, a cruel hint of a smile touching his lips. "Privacy, you see, is a privilege, not a right. Not in my home." Helen gasped, a small, wounded sound. "Sir, you had no right." "I have every right," he cut her off, his voice slicing through the air. He walked over to the desk and picked up the photograph, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of distasteful evidence. "Walter Mayhew, Sergeant, First Class, recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action. A real hero, apparently." He said the word hero with a dripping sarcasm that made Clara's fists clench. "He was a hero," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "Was he?" Mr. Rothwell mused, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the picture. He looked from the photograph to Clara, a strange, intense light in his eyes. "My father was in that war." He spoke of men like this, men who ran toward the sound of gunfire. He also spoke of the cost, the price of that so-called heroism. He set the photograph down on the desk with a soft, dismissive tap. "Your project," he continued, his tone shifting back to one of cold command, "is to be your presentation. Here, in this room, to me." Clara stared at him, confused. "What? You will present your report on your grandfather," he clarified, a glint of perverse amusement in his eyes. "You will tell me all about this great man, this hero, and you will convince me." "Convince you of what?" Clara asked, her voice small. "That he was everything you believe him to be," Mr. Rothwell said. "And if you don't," he let the threat hang in the air, then turned his icy gaze on Helen. "If you fail to be persuasive, your mother's employment will be terminated. Immediately." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a game designed for her to fail. He wasn't just attacking her mother's livelihood anymore. He was attacking her family, her history, the memory of the person she admired most in the world. He was taking something pure and turning it into a weapon against her. Helen started to plead, her voice choked with desperation. "Mr. Rothwell, please, no? She's a child. This is a school project. Don't do this." "The child stood her ground," he said, his voice mocking. "The child has opinions. The child invoked her brave grandfather. I am merely giving her the stage to prove her case. You have 24 hours to prepare. Tomorrow, at 4 o'clock sharp, the performance will begin." He turned back to the window, a clear dismissal. The audience was over. The bus ride home was a blur of silent misery. Helen wept, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. Clara sat beside her, her small body rigid, the photograph of her grandfather clutched in her hand. The proud, smiling young man in the picture seemed to be looking at her, a silent question in his eyes. What would he do? That night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat at their small kitchen table, the contents of her backpack spread out before her. There were her handwritten notes, a few more old photographs, and a heavy, bronze medal in a velvet-lined box. The Silver Star. Her grandfather had never talked about the war, not really. He had told her stories about the friendships, the funny moments, the feeling of coming home. But he never spoke of the fighting, of the moment that earned him this medal. Her grandmother used to say that the bravest soldiers were the ones who left the war behind them. Clara's presentation for school was simple. It was about his life after the war, how he came home, started a small carpentry business, raised a family, and became a beloved figure in their community, known for his quiet kindness and unshakable integrity. But she knew that wouldn't be enough for Mr. Rothwell. He didn't want to hear about kindness. He wanted to hear about gallantry. He wanted the story of the hero, the story her grandfather had never wanted to tell. She felt a knot of despair tighten in her stomach. How could she convince a man like Mr. Rothwell of anything? He didn't believe in heroes. He probably didn't believe in goodness at all. He had set an impossible task, and he was sitting in his glass tower, waiting for her to fail. Her mother came into the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen. She knelt beside Clara's chair. "We can just leave, sweet pea," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "We can pack our things. I can find another job. We don't have to go back there." Clara looked at her mother's worn, tired face. She saw the fear, but she also saw the love, a fierce, protective love that would sacrifice anything for her. And in that moment, Clara understood. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It wasn't just about standing up to a bully. It was about honor. Mr. Rothwell had taken her grandfather's memory and was trying to tarnish it, to use it as a tool for his cruelty. She couldn't let that happen. Letting him win would be a betrayal of everything her grandfather stood for. She looked at the medal, its polished surface cool against her palm. She thought of his words, the ones that had started all this. There are times to be quiet, and there are times to stand your ground. "No, Mom," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have to do it. I have to go back." Helen looked at her, searching her daughter's face. She saw the fear there, but underneath it, she saw a flicker of the same unshakable resolve she used to see in her own father's eyes. It was the Mayhew spirit, stubborn and strong. A small, sad smile touched Helen's lips. She nodded, pulling her daughter into a fierce hug. The next day, the penthouse felt even colder and more intimidating than usual. The silence was heavier, charged with anticipation. At precisely 4 o'clock, the intercom buzzed again. "My office. It's time." Clara walked into the room, her mother a few steps behind her. Mr. Rothwell was seated behind his massive desk, his hands steepled before him. He looked like a king holding court. He had turned one of the plush visitors' chairs to face the desk directly. It looked like a witness stand, or a throne for a sacrifice. "The stage is yours," he said, his voice flat. Clara took a deep breath. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard she felt he must be able to hear it. She walked to the chair and turned it around, so it faced away from the desk and toward the open room where her mother stood. Then, instead of sitting, she stood beside it. She would not be his witness. She would be a storyteller. She held the worn, black-and-white photograph of her grandfather in her hand. She looked at her mother, offering a small, shaky smile. Then she began to speak, her voice clear and steady in the oppressive silence. "My grandfather was Walter Mayhew," she started. "And he was a hero, but maybe not for the reason you think." She didn't talk about the battles. She didn't talk about the enemy soldiers or the acts of gallantry. She told the story of the man who came home from a terrible war and spent the rest of his life building things instead of breaking them. She spoke of the houses he built for families in their town, the little wooden toys he carved for the neighborhood children, the community garden he started on an abandoned lot. "Being a hero isn't about being the strongest or the loudest," Clara said, her voice gaining confidence. "He used to say that any man can be brave for a moment, in the heat of a battle. But it takes a different kind of courage to be a good man, every single day, for a lifetime." She spoke of his quiet integrity, how he once tore down the frame of a house he was building and started over, setting himself back weeks, because he discovered the wood wasn't up to his standards. No one would have known, she said, looking directly at Mr. Rothwell. The inspectors had already signed off, but he would have known, and that was enough. Mr. Rothwell sat behind his desk, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her, his fingers still steepled, his eyes never leaving her face. Finally, Clara held up the silver star, letting the light from the window catch its surface. "He got this for saving 3 men from a burning tank," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He never told me that story. I found it in a box of old newspaper clippings after he was gone. He didn't like to talk about the war. He said the real battle wasn't fought over there. He said the real battle is every day. It's the choice to be kind when you could be cruel. The choice to be honest when you could lie. The choice to build when it's so much easier to break." She set the metal down gently on the corner of the desk. She had finished. Her whole body was trembling from the effort. The silence that followed was absolute. She had stood her ground. She had defended her hero. Now it was his move. Mr. Rothwell was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the metal. The cold, mocking amusement was gone from his face, replaced by an expression Clara couldn't decipher. It was something deep and distant, a shadow of an old pain. Finally, he lifted his eyes and looked at her. "The choice to build when it's so much easier to break," he repeated softly, almost to himself. He looked from Clara to Helen, and then back again. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, staring down at the city he owned. "You have failed," he said, his back still to them. Helen's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. After everything, it wasn't enough. "You have failed to convince me," he continued, his voice low and even. "Because I already knew." He turned around. His face was a storm of conflicting emotions. "I knew who Walter Mayhew was. He was in my father's unit. He was one of the men my father commanded." He paused, his gaze locking with Clara's. "And he was the man who pulled my father from that burning tank." The revelation landed in the silent room with the force of a physical explosion. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. The man who had tormented her, who had humiliated her mother, who seemed to embody everything cruel and heartless in the world, was bound to her by an impossible thread of history. His life, his very existence, was owed to the man whose memory he had just desecrated. Helen's hand flew to her mouth, a stifled gasp escaping her lips. She stared at Mr. Rothwell, her eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous understanding. All the small, pointless cruelties of the past weeks suddenly seemed like pieces of a different, more tragic puzzle. "You're your father?" Helen stammered, her voice barely audible. "My father saved your father?" Mr. Rothwell nodded, his gaze distant, lost in a memory that was clearly as vivid and painful as if it had happened yesterday. He walked away from the window and slowly sank into one of the plush chairs, the one Clara had refused to sit in. For the first time since they had met him, he didn't look like a king on a throne. He looked like a man carrying an impossibly heavy weight. "My father was Captain James Rothwell," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual commanding tone. "He was a hard man, a man who believed in strength above all else. He saw the world in black and white, strong and weak, winners and losers. He came back from the war with a body full of shrapnel and a spirit full of ghosts." He paused, looking down at his own hands, which rested, uncharacteristically still, on the arms of the chair. He never spoke of the man who saved him by name. He only ever referred to him as the sergeant. "A quiet man," he'd say, "a carpenter from somewhere in the Midwest." He told the story only once, late one night when he thought I was asleep. He described the fire, the smell of burning metal and fuel. He described being trapped, his leg pinned, the certainty of his own death. And then, he described a hand reaching through the smoke, a voice calm and steady, and the sheer, stubborn strength of a man who refused to leave him behind. Clara looked at the picture of her grandfather, the quiet carpenter with the kind smile, and tried to imagine him in that inferno. She tried to reconcile the gentle man who taught her how to plant tomatoes with the fearless soldier who would walk into fire for a stranger. "The sergeant was wounded himself," Mr. Rothwell continued, his voice thick with an old, inherited grief. He dragged my father half a mile to a field hospital. And then, he disappeared back into the war. My father tried to find him afterwards, to thank him, but he was gone. He was told the sergeant had been shipped home. My father spent years looking for him. He felt he owed the man a debt that could never truly be repaid. All he had was a name, Mayhew, and a story. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes, stripped of their icy armor, were filled with a profound, aching sadness. He looked at Clara. "My father was not a good man when he came back," he said, his voice raw with a confession decades in the making. "The war broke something inside him. He became all like me. Hard. Unforgiving. He built this company on the same principles he used to command his men: fear and intimidation. He taught me that kindness was a weakness. That sentiment was a liability. He taught me to build walls, to trust no one, to see every interaction as a battle to be won." He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, the sprawling city visible through the glass. "He built all of this, and he was the most miserable man I have ever known. He died in this very building, surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, and completely, utterly alone." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the cold, tense silence of fear. It was a heavy, thoughtful silence, filled with the weight of unspoken history and shared, unexpected grief. "When I saw the name on your school papers," Mr. Rothwell said, his gaze returning to the photograph on his desk, "I thought it had to be a coincidence. But when I saw that picture, I knew. He had the same eyes as the man in the few faded photographs my father kept in his desk drawer. The man he could never find. The hero he could never thank." He let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a wall crumbling. "All this time, you've been right here, cleaning my floors." The self-loathing in his voice was palpable. "I saw your defiance, your strength, and it reminded me of him, of the stories my father told. It enraged me. I wanted to break it. I wanted to prove that my father was wrong, that there are no heroes, that everyone has a breaking point." He looked at Helen, his expression pained with a genuine, soul-deep remorse. "And I used you to do it. I was cruel, unforgivably cruel, to the daughter of the man my father owed his life to." Helen, who had stood frozen, listening to his story, finally moved. She took a step forward, her expression no longer one of fear, but of a profound, heartbreaking pity. She had spent weeks terrified of a monster, only to find a broken man. "My father, Walter, he wouldn't have wanted you to be like this," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He didn't believe in debts. He believed in people. He would have wanted you to be happy." The simple, unadorned sincerity of her words seemed to strike Mr. Rothwell more deeply than any accusation could have. He flinched, as if the idea of her father wishing him happiness was a pain he couldn't bear. Clara, who had been silent through the entire confession, felt a strange new emotion bubbling up inside her. The anger was gone, washed away by the tide of his story. The fear was gone, replaced by a surprising and unwelcome sense of empathy. He was still the man who had deliberately spilled coffee and mocked her mother, but he was also a boy who had been raised by a sad, broken soldier. He was a man who had been taught that the only way to survive was to become a fortress. She thought of her own grandfather. She thought of his warmth, his easy laughter, the smell of sawdust in his workshop. He had come back from the same war that had broken James Rothwell. But Walter Mayhew had chosen to build, and James Rothwell had chosen to fight. And here, 2 generations later, were the results of those choices: a small girl who knew how to stand her ground with courage, and a lonely billionaire who only knew how to stand his ground with cruelty. Clara walked forward. She picked up the silver star from the corner of his desk. She walked over to his chair, her footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. She held it out to him. Mr. Rothwell looked at the medal in her small hand, then up at her face. His own eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "He didn't like this," Clara said quietly. "He said it was just a reminder of the worst day of his life. He said the real rewards were the things that came after." She placed the medal gently in his hand. His fingers, long and elegant, closed around the heavy bronze. He stared at it, his throat working. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Walter Mayhew hadn't wanted to be thanked. He hadn't wanted a reward. He had simply wanted to come home and live a good, quiet life. He had wanted the men he saved to do the same. James Rothwell had lived, but he had never truly come home, and he had passed that exile down to his son. I am sorry, Harrison Rothwell whispered, the words sounding foreign and clumsy on his tongue. It was an apology directed at Helen, at Clara, and at the ghost of a man he had never met. For everything. He finally looked up at Helen, his eyes pleading. Please, don't go. Stay. Not as my housekeeper. I need. He struggled for the right words. I need to fix this. Let me fix this. Helen looked at her daughter. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. It was about something more complicated. It was about the choice to build when it's so much easier to break. The battle was over. The war, it seemed, had finally come to an end. Now, all that was left was the long, quiet work of rebuilding. The word sorry did not magically erase the weeks of fear and humiliation. It did not instantly mend the fractures of power and class that separated them. But it was a start. It was a seed of something new being planted in the barren soil of the cold, silent penthouse. In the days that followed, a strange and delicate truce settled over the top floor. The air, once thick with tension, was now filled with a different kind of quiet, an awkward, uncertain silence as three people, bound by a ghost, tried to figure out who they were to each other now. Mr. Rothwell, he insisted they call him Harrison, a request that felt both momentous and impossible, was a man adrift. He had spent his entire adult life building walls, and he seemed to have no idea how to take them down. His attempts at kindness were clumsy, like a man trying to handle delicate glassware with hands accustomed to wielding a hammer. He started by firing Mrs. Gable. It was a swift, decisive action. Helen learned of it not from him, but from another member of the staff who spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones, as if a long-reigning tyrant had finally been deposed. The official reason was restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. The Queen of Quiet Cruelty had been exiled from the kingdom. His next act was a conversation with Helen in his office. Clara was not invited this time. She sat on the living room sofa, a piece of furniture she was now allowed to touch, and waited, her stomach in knots. When her mother emerged an hour later, her face was a canvas of shock, disbelief, and a profound, life-altering relief. He wants me to be the estate manager, Helen told Clara, her voice trembling with the weight of the words. Not just for the penthouse. For all of his properties. He's doubling my salary. He's setting up a college fund for you, Clara. A full one. Enough for anywhere you want to go. The offer was staggering, a gesture so grand it felt like something from a dream. It was a clear, unambiguous attempt to atone, to use his immense wealth to build a bridge across the chasm he had created between them. But it was the smaller moments that truly marked the change. Harrison began to leave his office door open. He would emerge, not with a criticism or a demand, but with a question. Clara, he said one afternoon, his voice still carrying the awkward echo of command. The stock market fell 300 points today. Do you know what that signifies? Clara, who had been reading about the fall of the Roman Empire, looked up, startled. No, sir, she said, the sir slipping out from habit. He didn't correct her. Instead, he walked over, his expensive suit seeming out of place in the quiet domesticity of the moment. He proceeded to explain the intricate dance of bulls and bears, of market confidence and economic indicators. He spoke not as a billionaire lecturing a child, but as a teacher, eager to share a piece of the world he understood. Clara, who loved learning, found herself listening, fascinated. He was opening up his world to her, not just his home. He started eating his meals not in his silent office, but at the small table in the vast, state-of-the-art kitchen. He would invite Helen and Clara to join him. The first few meals were painfully awkward, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. But slowly, tentatively, conversations began to bloom. He asked Helen about her life before this job, about her dreams. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her childhood, of her parents, of her late husband. He asked Clara about school, about her friends, about her favorite books. He learned that her grandfather had taught her how to play chess, and the next day, a beautiful, hand-carved marble chess set appeared on a table in the living room. They played their first game in a charged silence. He was a brilliant, aggressive player, his mind always several moves ahead. But Clara was her grandfather's granddaughter. She was patient, observant, and she had a core of unshakable resolve. He won, but she made him work for it. After he checkmated her king, a genuine, unforced smile touched Harrison Rothwell's lips for the first time. "You play with his strategy," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "You sacrifice pawns to gain position. You never surrender your queen. Your grandfather was a remarkable man." "Yes, he was," Clara said simply. Through these small interactions, the monstrous billionaire began to recede, and a new man emerged. Harrison Rothwell was still a man of immense power and wealth, but Clara and Helen began to see the lonely boy behind the curtain, the boy raised in the shadow of a broken hero, the man who had only ever been taught the language of battle. He was learning a new language now, one of kindness and connection, and they were his unlikely teachers. One Saturday morning, Harrison found Clara in the living room, staring at the grand piano, the one they had been so painstakingly polishing just a few weeks before. "Do you wish you knew how to play?" he asked, his voice softer than she was used to. Clara nodded. "My mom always wanted me to learn, but we could never afford lessons." Harrison said nothing more about it. But the following Tuesday, a woman with a kind smile and a leather music case arrived at the penthouse. She was a professor from the city's most prestigious conservatory. "Mr. Rothwell has arranged for me to be your instructor," she said to a stunned Clara. "He said to tell you that a house this big needs some music." So, the penthouse that had once been a museum of silence began to fill with sound. At first, it was the clumsy, halting notes of a beginner learning her scales. But soon, simple melodies began to drift through the vast rooms. The music seemed to soften the sharp edges of the place, to warm the cold marble and glass. It was the sound of a home, slowly, tentatively, coming to life. Helen, in her new role as estate manager, blossomed. The fear and anxiety that had haunted her were replaced by a quiet, confident authority. She was no longer a ghost in a blue uniform, but a woman in charge, respected by the staff and trusted implicitly by her employer. She and Harrison developed a relationship of mutual respect, two people from different worlds who had found common ground in their shared connection to a man long gone. The true measure of the change, however, came on a gray, drizzly afternoon about a month after the confession. Clara was finishing her piano lesson when Harrison entered the room. He wasn't wearing one of his severe, perfectly tailored suits. He was dressed in casual slacks and a soft cashmere sweater. He looked younger, less like a fortress. He held a simple, framed photograph in his hands. It was old and slightly faded. It showed two young men in uniform, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a face Clara knew intimately, her grandfather, Walter Mayhew. The other, a handsome man with a troubled smile and haunted eyes, was a stranger. "That's my father," Harrison said, his voice quiet. He handed the frame to Clara. "I found it at the bottom of his old trunk. It was the only picture he kept from the war." Clara looked at the image, at the two young men who had shared a moment of friendship in the heart of a nightmare. One had come home and filled his life with light. The other had come home and filled his life with shadows. And now, their legacies were intertwined in this room, in this strange, makeshift family. "My mother said my grandfather never thought of himself as a hero," Clara said, tracing the outline of her grandfather's smiling face with her finger. "She said he always told her, the real heroes were the ones who didn't come back." Harrison looked out the massive window, not at the city he owned, but at the gray, rain-streaked sky. "Perhaps," he said softly, "or perhaps the real heroes are the ones who come back from the darkness and still choose to build things in the light." He turned and looked at Clara, then at Helen, who had entered the room, drawn by their quiet conversation. A look of profound, unburdened gratitude settled on his face. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by wealth, but he had been starving. He had lived in a palace, but he had been homeless. The rude billionaire that the staff had avoided was gone. In his place was a man who was just beginning to learn how to live. And it had all started because a maid's daughter, a girl with her grandfather's courageous heart, had refused to be broken. She had stood her ground, not just for her mother, but for the memory of a good man. And in doing so, she had not only saved their future, she had redeemed his past. The silence in the penthouse was finally, truly gone, replaced by the quiet, hopeful music of a new beginning. But this wasn't just Clara's story. Every day, in quiet corners of wealthy homes and towering offices, ordinary workers face impossible choices between pride and survival, silence and courage. Clara stood her ground, and in doing so, changed not only her mother's life, but the heart of a man everyone thought was beyond redemption. The question is, how many more stories like this go untold? So while you're here, I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe unwinding after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. Like this video if you believe even small acts of courage can rewrite someone's story, and subscribe for more true accounts that prove bravery doesn't always roar. It often whispers and changes everything.